The rain wasn't just hitting the armored glass, it was hammering it, a rhythmic drumming that sealed us inside the SUV like a diving bell. My hands were at 10 and 2, leather gripping leather, my breathing steady, measured, professional. I exist only when necessary. In the back seat, Julian was a silhouette of charcoal wool and exhaustion, his face turned toward the blurred city lights. But then he looked up. His eyes found mine in the rearview mirror. It wasn't a casual glance. It held on, tight and searching, for a second that stretched into an eternity. That was the moment the threat assessment changed. The danger wasn't outside the car anymore. It was the silence sitting heavy between us. His world was built on the premise that safety requires separation. The penthouse wasn't a home. It was a containment unit floating 50 stories above the grime of the street. Floor-to-ceiling glass, polished marble that reflected everything but held no warmth, and air that was filtered so many times it tasted like nothing at all. This was the aquarium, and he was the prize specimen, swimming in circles while the world pressed its nose against the glass. My post was by the north wall, near the private elevator. From there, I had a clear line of sight to the main entry, the terrace doors, and him. Always him. My instructions were specific. Maintain visual contact, secure the perimeter, remain unobtrusive. A piece of furniture with a concealed carry permit. But furniture doesn't notice the way a man's shoulders slump when the door clicks shut. Furniture doesn't memorize the specific cadence of footsteps. Click, pause, click. That signals a headache is forming behind the eyes. The silence in that apartment was aggressive. It wasn't peaceful. It was a vacuum waiting to be filled. The only sounds were the low electronic hum of the HVAC system keeping the temperature at a precise 68 degrees, and the rustle of papers as Julian reviewed contracts at the dining table. He sat there for hours, a solitary figure in a room designed for parties of 50. I watched him. It's the job, I told myself. Situational awareness. But you can lie to your superiors. You can lie to the client, but you can't lie to your own nervous system. I wasn't just watching for intruders. I was watching the way his hand trembled slightly when he reached for his water glass. I was cataloging the tension in his jaw, the way he rubbed the back of his neck when he thought I wasn't looking. The scent of him, sandalwood and something sharper, like cedar or cold air, drifted across the expanse of the room. It was faint, a ghost of a smell, but my brain latched onto it. In the stillness, that scent became a tether. It was the only organic thing in a world of steel and chrome. The struggle wasn't purely physical. It was mental. To do this job, to really do it, you have to dehumanize the principal. He is the asset. He is the package. If you see him as a man, you hesitate. If you see him as a person who is lonely, who is tired, who is terrified, you might make a mistake. You might step out of the shadows not to block a bullet, but to offer a hand. And that is not the protocol. That is the failure. I forced myself to recite the exit strategies. Stairwell A, freight elevator, panic room code. But the numbers blurred against the reality of his presence. I stood there, spine rigid, hands clasped behind my back, fighting the urge to break the formation. I analyzed the threats, the window washer rig on the adjacent building, the new delivery guy at the lobby desk, the glitch in the security feed from the garage. But my mind kept drifting back to the threat sitting 20 feet away, the threat of a man who looked at me not like I was a wall, but like I was the only other living thing in the universe. The air between us felt charged, like the atmosphere before a lightning strike. It wasn't just proximity, it was awareness. He knew I was watching. I knew he knew. And in that vast, cold room, that shared awareness felt like a secret. Then the phone would ring, or the schedule would shift, and the stillness would shatter. The transition was always jarring. We would move from the suspended animation of the penthouse to the tactical precision of transit. The asset would stand up, button his jacket, and the mask would slide back into place. I would tap my earpiece, confirm the route, and open the door. But for those few seconds before we left, before the world got its claws back into him, the look would return. A glance, a hesitation, a silent acknowledgement that we were leaving the cage only to enter a smaller, faster one. The armored SUV is a marvel of engineering, designed to keep the world out, but nobody talks about what happens when it locks you in. The moment the heavy door thudded shut, sealing the cabin, the atmosphere shifted instantly. We were no longer in the city. We were in a capsule, a leather-lined, pressurized chamber moving through the arteries of a dying rush hour. The driver, a man named Miller who spoke only in grid coordinates, raised the privacy partition without being asked. The black glass slid up with a pneumatic hiss, cutting off the front seat, cutting off the road, cutting off the last buffer I had. Now it was just the two of us. The space in the back was generous for a civilian vehicle, but for a security detail, it was a tactical nightmare. It was intimate, too intimate. There were exactly 12 inches of black leather seat between his thigh and mine, neutral ground that felt less like a buffer and more like a demilitarized zone waiting for a treaty violation. The air in the cabin was still, recycled, and rapidly filling with the scent of him, intensifying in the confined space. It was heavy, cloying in a way that made my chest feel tight. I kept my eyes on the side mirrors, scanning the blurred shapes of motorcycles and delivery trucks weaving through the gridlock. It was the job. Keep the head on a swivel. But my peripheral vision was a traitor. It kept drifting back to the center of the seat. Julian had pulled a tablet from his briefcase, the blue light from the screen illuminating the sharp angles of his face, casting deep shadows under his eyes. He wasn't reading. His eyes weren't tracking text. He was staring at the screen with a glazed, unfocused look, his breathing shallow and uneven. I could hear the shift in his respiration. In the silence of the armored cabin, sound is magnified. I heard the rustle of his suit fabric as he crossed his legs. I heard the soft, rhythmic tap of his finger against the edge of the tablet case, and I could feel the heat. It was absurd, scientifically impossible, but I swore I could feel the warmth radiating from his arm, bridging the 12-inch gap and soaking into my side. It was a magnetic pull, a physical gravity that required actual muscular effort to resist. I wanted to lean in. The urge wasn't sexual, or at least, it wasn't just sexual. It was a primal, protective instinct to close the gap, to put myself between him and whatever invisible weight was crushing him. Then, the world intervened. A taxi cut across 3 lanes of traffic, forcing Miller to slam on the brakes. The SUV lurched violently to the left, the heavy chassis groaning under the shift in momentum. Physics took over. I braced automatically, my hand shooting out to the grab handle, but Julian wasn't ready. He slid. It happened in a fraction of a second. His body weight shifted, closing the distance instantly. His knee knocked against mine, hard. His shoulder pressed into my bicep. For a heartbeat, the gap was gone. We were pressed together, thigh to thigh, arm to arm, the sudden contact sending a jolt of static electricity straight up my spine that had nothing to do with the car's wiring. The SUV corrected. The momentum settled. By all rights, he should have pulled back. He should have murmured an apology, adjusted his suit, and retreated to his side of the leather divide. He didn't move. He stayed there, pressed against me, the heat of his leg burning through the layers of our trousers. I didn't move either. I couldn't. My training screamed, create distance, reassess, secure. But my body went rigid, paralyzed by the sudden, overwhelming reality of his proximity. I could feel the tension in his muscles, the slight tremor in his thigh against mine. He wasn't just falling against me, he was leaning. He was borrowing my stability because he had none left of his own. Slowly, terrifyingly, he turned his head. He didn't look at my face. He looked at my hand, which was gripping the leather armrest between us, knuckles white. Then his gaze traveled up my arm, over the shoulder holster hidden beneath my jacket, and finally met my eyes. The look wasn't the imperious glare of a client inconvenienced by a rough ride. It was open. It was raw. In the dim light of the cabin, with the rain streaking shadows across his face, the professional distance evaporated. He was looking at me not as the furniture, not as the shield, but as a man who was currently the only thing keeping him upright. The air in the car thickened, becoming viscous and hard to breathe. The unspoken question hung there, suspended in the silence. You feel this too, don't you? Are you all right, sir? My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, rough, lower than usual, stripped of its professional polish. Julian didn't blink. He didn't pull his leg away. He just held my gaze, his eyes dark and searching, looking for a crack in the armor. I'm fine, he whispered. But the way he said it, soft, breathless, made it sound like a lie we were both agreeing to tell. The SUV slowed, turning onto the gravel drive of the event venue. The spell broke. The kinetic energy of the turn forced us apart, the cold leather rushing back in to fill the void. Julian straightened his tie, the mask of the untouchable billionaire slamming back into place with terrifying speed. But as the car came to a halt and I reached for the door handle, my skin still burned where he had touched me. The line had been crossed, and we both knew there was no way to uncross it. The penthouse at 3 a.m. is a different beast entirely. During the day, it's a fortress of light and hard edges, but in the dead of night, it becomes a cavern. The staff had long since retreated to their quarters or the city below, leaving the main floor in a heavy, suffocating silence. The lights were dimmed to a low, amber bleed along the floorboards, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched across the marble like reaching fingers. I was stationed by the east wall, a shadow merging with the dark velvet curtains. My shift doesn't technically end until the sun hits the horizon, so I stood in the darkness, a statue breathing recycled air, waiting for a threat that usually came from the elevator. I didn't expect the threat to come from the hallway. Julian wandered in like a ghost. There were no footsteps, just the soft shift of air pressure as he entered the room. He had shed the armor, the bespoke suit, the silk tie, the diamond cufflinks. He was wearing a simple gray t-shirt that looked too large for him and sweatpants that hung low on his hips. He looked younger, smaller. The titan of industry was gone, replaced by a man who couldn't outrun his own mind. He was barefoot, his vulnerability exposed against the cold stone floor. He didn't acknowledge me at first. He went straight to the kitchen island, the marble surface glowing faintly in the dark. I watched him reach for a glass. His hand was shaking. Not a little, a lot. A fine, rhythmic tremor that made the crystal chime against the granite counter. Clink, clink. It was the sound of a nervous system redlining, a frequency of distress that set my teeth on edge. He poured the water, but he didn't drink. He just gripped the glass with both hands, white-knuckling it, trying to force his body into stillness through sheer will. "You're hovering," he said. He didn't turn around. His voice was rough, unused for hours, stripped of its boardroom polish. "I'm standing guard, sir," I replied. My voice was low, modulated carefully not to break the fragile atmosphere. "Guard," he repeated, tasting the word like it was bitter ash. He turned then, leaning his hip against the counter. "Who guards you, Elias?" It was the first time he had used my name in 3 months. Not agent, not you, but Elias. The sound of it in the dark room felt like a violation of protocol, or maybe a gift. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The protocol doesn't have a script for when the asset asks about your soul. He pushed off the counter and started walking. Not away from me, but toward me. He moved slowly, dragging his feet slightly, stripped of that crisp executive stride. He stopped at the window directly in front of where I was standing. The glass was cold, radiating a chill that seeped into the room. He was close enough that I could smell soap and fatigue, a raw human scent that undercut the sterile luxury of the room. "It's too quiet up here," he whispered, pressing his forehead against the pane. "I can see a million people down there, but I can't hear a single one. It's like being dead." I wanted to reach out. The urge was a physical ache in my chest, sharp and demanding. I wanted to put my hand on that trembling shoulder, to ground him, to say, "You're not dead. I'm here. I'm right here." But I remained a statue. My hands stayed clasped behind my back, fingers gripping my own wrist so hard it hurt. That pain was my anchor. It was the only thing keeping me from crossing the line that separates the hired help from the human being. "You're safe here, sir," I said. It was the wrong thing to say. A platitude. A lie. He laughed, a dry, brittle sound. "Safe," he mocked. He turned his head, looking at me over his shoulder. His eyes were dark pools in the shadows, reflecting the city lights. "I don't need to be safe, Elias. I need—" He trailed off. The word hung in the air, unsaid but deafening. Held? Seen? Real? He took a step back, intruding into my personal space. He was inside my guard radius. If he were anyone else, he'd be on the floor. But he was him. He stood so close I could feel the heat radiating off his skin again, just like in the car. But this time, there was no leather divider. There was just air, and very little of it. "You're shaking too," he murmured, his eyes dropping to my hands behind my back. He was right. The proximity was doing something to my adrenaline levels that a loaded gun never could. The air between us was thick, pressurized. He looked up at me, his expression stripped raw, waiting for me to break, waiting for me to be a man instead of a wall. And for a terrifying second, I almost did. I almost unlocked my hands. I almost let the mask fall. Then the silence didn't just break, it shattered. The perimeter alarm screamed, a high, piercing wail that cut through the intimacy like a serrated knife. The red strobe on the security panel pulsed, turning the room into a chaotic strobe of blood and shadow. The moment was dead. The man was gone. The asset was back. The world turned red. That was the only way to describe it. 1 second, we were two men standing on the precipice of a confession, breathing the same charged air. The next, the room was a strobe-lit nightmare of pulsing crimson light and a siren that vibrated in the marrow of my bones. The transition wasn't mental, it was biological. The part of me that was Elias, the man who wanted to touch him, was shoved into a dark box and locked away. The machine took over. I didn't ask him to move. I didn't use the polite, deferential language of the daylight hours. I moved. My hand shot out, not to comfort, but to command. I grabbed his upper arm, hard. My fingers dug into the soft cotton of his t-shirt, finding the muscle underneath. It was a grip that would leave bruises, a violation of every boundary we had established over the last 6 months. But the boundaries were gone. They had burned up in the red light. "Move," I barked, the word a guttural snap. Julian didn't argue. He didn't freeze. He collapsed into my gravity. For a man who commanded boardrooms with a raised eyebrow, he surrendered control instantly. He let me be the compass. I shoved him toward the service corridor, my body curling around his like a shell. I became a wall of Kevlar and instinct, designed to take the impact so he didn't have to. We hit the stairwell door at a run. The heavy steel slammed shut behind us, cutting off the wail of the siren, replacing it with the hollow, terrifying echo of our own breathing against concrete. The air here was cold, smelling of dust and uncirculated tension. We descended, fast. I was practically carrying him, my hand never leaving his back, guiding him, pushing him, keeping him tethered to me. Somewhere between the 40th and the 30th floor, he stumbled. His bare foot slipped on the smooth concrete. He would have gone down, face first into the hard edge of a step, but I had him. I hauled him back, spinning him around so his back hit the wall and my body pinned him there. For 3 seconds, we froze. It was supposed to be a tactical pause. I was listening for footsteps, for the click of a weapon, for the enemy. But all I could hear was him. He was gasping for air, his chest heaving against mine. We were pressed together in the dim emergency lighting of the stairwell, closer than we had ever been in the car. I could feel the frantic hammering of his heart against his ribs, beating in a terrifying sync with my own. His hands were clutching the lapels of my jacket, gripping the fabric so tightly his knuckles were white. He wasn't holding on for balance, he was holding on for life. I looked down at him. His eyes were blown wide, black holes of panic. "Elias," he choked out, a sound that was half prayer, half plea. "I've got you," I growled. My voice was unrecognizable. It was possessive. It was fierce. It wasn't the voice of an employee protecting an asset. It was the voice of a man protecting the only thing that mattered. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't scared of failing the job. I was terrified of him stopping. "I've got you," I repeated, and I meant it in a way that terrified me. I pulled him off the wall. We kept moving. The descent was a blur of gray concrete and yellow railings, a spiral down into the dark. When we burst into the subterranean garage, the extraction team wasn't there yet. Miller was 3 minutes out. We were exposed. I shoved him into the back of the emergency sedan, a nondescript reinforced sedan kept for exactly this nightmare. I didn't wait for a driver. I vaulted into the front seat, the engine roaring to life before my door was even closed. The tires screamed against the polished epoxy floor as I tore out of the slip, the vehicle fishtailing slightly before the traction control bit down. We hit the street. It was chaos. Flashes of cameras, shouting, the confusion of the perimeter breach. But inside the car, it was dead silent. I drove with a singular, cold focus, weaving through the late-night traffic, putting distance between us and the red light. I checked the rearview mirror. Julian was huddled in the corner of the back seat, knees pulled to his chest, shivering violently. He looked broken. I made the call then. I didn't radio headquarters. I didn't call the firm. I tapped the secure line to the one place that wasn't on the official manifest. "We're going dark," I said to the empty air. I wasn't taking him to the secondary hotel. I wasn't taking him to the firm's holding facility. I was taking him to the one place where the world couldn't touch him. The cabin. The isolation. Just us. I looked in the mirror again. He was watching me. His shivering had stopped, replaced by a steady, intense gaze fixed on the back of my head. He knew we were off script. He knew I had just kidnapped him, in a way, and he looked relieved. "Where are we going?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. "Somewhere they can't find you," I promised. "Somewhere quiet." He didn't ask anything else. He just leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes, trusting me with his life, trusting me with the silence. The city faded behind us, replaced by the dark stretch of the highway, and the only thing left was the hum of the tires and the terrifying weight of what I was willing to do to keep him safe. The cabin wasn't on any map. It sat at the end of a dirt road that the rain was already turning into a river of mud, a small, dark shape huddled against the tree line. It wasn't a vacation home, it was a contingency plan, with a chimney. When I killed the engine, the silence that rushed in to fill the cabin was absolute. There was no hum of city traffic, no distant sirens, just the relentless, isolating drum of the storm on the metal roof. We were miles from the nearest paved road, and even further from the life Julian knew. Inside, the air was stale and cold, preserving the chill of months of vacancy. I moved through the dark rooms by memory, checking the perimeter, shuttering the windows, locking the heavy deadbolts. It was a routine I knew well, but doing it with him standing in the center of the room, shivering in his damp t-shirt, felt wrong. He looked like a displaced object, a piece of fine porcelain left in a workshop. "There are clothes in the back room," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the small space. "Wool, practical. Put them on." He didn't argue. He didn't ask for a valet. He just nodded and disappeared into the shadows. When he returned, the transformation was jarring. He was wearing an old, thick cable-knit sweater that belonged to the agency, generic, oversized, and rough. It swallowed his hands and softened the sharp, untouchable lines of his silhouette. He didn't look like a billionaire anymore. He looked like a man who had been lost in the woods. I built a fire. It was a primal necessity, not a luxury. The dry wood caught quickly, the flames licking up the bark and casting a flickering orange glow that warred with the gray light of the storm outside. The smell of wood smoke began to fill the room, replacing the sterile scent of the penthouse. It was an earthy, grounding smell. "I'm making food," I announced. I didn't ask what he wanted. There was no menu here. There were cans in the pantry and a gas stove. "I can help," he offered. He was standing by the hearth, warming his hands. "No," I said too quickly. "Sit, warm up. That's the priority." I needed the task. I needed the physical barrier of the counter between us. I opened a can of tomato soup and sliced some dense, shelf-stable bread. It was peasant food, the kind of meal his personal chef would have sneered at. But as the smell of heated tomato and basil rose in the damp air, his stomach growled. It was a human sound, loud and undeniable. He blushed, a flash of color high on his cheekbones that the firelight caught and held. We ate at the small, scarred wooden table near the fire. The room was intimate by necessity. In the penthouse, the dining table was a continent of mahogany that kept us oceans apart. Here, our knees were inches from bumping under the wood. I could hear him swallow. I could see the steam rising from his bowl and curling around his eyelashes. The silence here wasn't the cold, pressurized vacuum of the apartment. It was heavy, yes, but it was charged. It was the silence of a pressure cooker. The storm battered the walls, wind howling around the eaves, trying to get in. But inside, in this circle of firelight, the world had shrunk down to 2 bowls, 2 spoons, and 2 men trying desperately not to look at each other. But he was looking. I felt his gaze like a physical touch on my face. He wasn't watching the windows for threats. He was watching my hands as I broke the bread. He was tracking the movement of my throat when I drank water. Every time I glanced up, I caught him. He didn't look away. He didn't offer the polite deference of looking past the help. He looked right at me, studying the lines of my face with a hunger that had nothing to do with the soup. "It's quiet," he murmured. "It's safe," I corrected. "No." He shook his head, the firelight dancing in his dark eyes. "It's not safe, Elias. Not in here." He leaned forward slightly, the rough wool of his sweater brushing against the edge of the table. The distance between us closed another fraction. The air felt thin, electric. The walls of the cabin seemed to be pressing in, forcing us toward a collision that the protocol explicitly forbade, but which the man in me was starting to crave with a terrifying intensity. By the second afternoon, the cabin wasn't a shelter anymore. It was a cage. The storm hadn't let up. The rain was a relentless gray curtain that turned the day into a perpetual, suffocating twilight. We were trapped in a loop of time where the sun never truly rose and the shadows never fully retreated. No emails, no calls, no schedules. For a man like Julian, whose existence was measured in quarter-hour increments in global markets, the sudden stillness wasn't restful. It was corrosive. He paced. That was the soundtrack of the day, the soft thud drag of his wool socks on the floorboards. 4 paces to the darkened window, a sharp, agitated turn, 4 paces to the dying fire. Over and over. He was a tiger in a zoo enclosure that had suddenly shrunk to the size of a shoebox. I sat in the corner, cleaning a weapon that didn't need cleaning, stripping the slide and reassembling it just to give my hands something to do that wasn't reaching for him. I watched him through the haze of gun oil and wood smoke, tracking his movement like a radar dish. "I can't hear it," he said suddenly, stopping dead in the center of the room. His back was to me, his posture rigid. "Hear what?" I asked, not looking up from the slide assembly, though my muscles coiled tight, ready. "The city," he whispered. He turned around, and the look on his face stopped my hands cold. He looked unmoored. Panic was rising in him, a tide of white water crashing against the fragile dam of his composure. "I can't hear the hum. I don't know if the world is even there anymore. Maybe it's just us. Maybe we're all that's left." It wasn't a philosophical musing. It was a spiral. His breathing hitched, a sharp, ragged sound that cut through the noise of the rain. He gripped the back of the wooden chair, his knuckles turning the color of bone. He was hyperventilating. The isolation had stripped away the distraction of his empire, leaving him alone with whatever demons he usually outran in his armored car. The silence wasn't empty. It was screaming at him. "Julian," I said, standing up. The gun parts clattered onto the table. He didn't hear me. He was gasping now, eyes unfocused, staring at a spot on the floor as if the abyss was opening up beneath the rug. "It's too quiet. It's too loud. I can't." Protocol dictates that in the event of a client medical episode, you secure the area and call for extraction. Protocol does not say you cross the room in 3 strides and invade the personal space you were paid to protect. But protocol was a million miles away in a city that might not exist. I stepped into his orbit. "Julian, look at me." He didn't look. He was shaking, a fine, violent vibration that started in his hands and took over his whole frame. He was vibrating apart. I didn't think. I didn't calculate the threat assessment. I reached out. My hand landed on his shoulder. It was meant to be a firm, professional check, a grounding technique. But the moment my palm made contact with the rough wool of his sweater, the current slammed into me. The heat of his body was shocking, a furnace burning beneath the layers. He gasped, a sharp intake of breath, but he didn't pull away. He froze. "Breathe," I commanded, my voice dropping to that low, rough register that seemed to belong only to this cabin. I felt the tension in his trapezius muscle, tight as a steel cable. My thumb moved. It wasn't a conscious decision, it was instinct. I rubbed a slow, heavy circle against the knot of muscle. Then, my hand slid up. It moved from the safety of his shoulder, up the column of his neck, until my fingers curved around the nape, my thumb resting just below his ear. Skin. The contact was electric. His skin was fever hot, damp with the sweat of his panic. I could feel his pulse hammering against my thumb. Thud, thud, thud. A frantic bird trapped in a cage. "I'm here," I whispered, stepping closer until the toes of my boots touched his. "You're not alone. I'm right here." Julian let out a sound that was half sob, half sigh. The fight went out of him. He didn't just accept the touch. He leaned into it. He tilted his head back, pressing his skull into my palm, closing his eyes. His weight shifted, tipping backward until I was the only thing holding him upright. For a long moment, the only sound was the rain and our breathing, which was slowly, inevitably sinking up. I watched his face, the way his lashes fluttered against his cheeks, the way his lips parted slightly as the air returned to his lungs. He looked wrecked. He looked beautiful. "Elias," he breathed. He turned his head slightly, nuzzling into my hand. The sensation of his hair against my fingers, the vulnerability of his throat exposed to me. It was too much. The air in the room was no longer just pressurized, it was flammable. If I moved my hand an inch, my thumb would be on his jaw. If I leaned forward 6 inches, my mouth would be on his. I was guarding a body. But in that moment, holding him while the storm raged outside, I realized I wanted to do so much more than just keep him alive. I wanted to be the reason he breathed. Slowly, agonizingly, I pulled my hand away. The loss of contact was a physical cold snap. Julian's eyes flew open, dark and dazed, searching mine. We stood there in the dimming light, the ghost of my touch still burning between us, as the gray afternoon finally surrendered to the heavy, suffocating blackness of night. The darkness didn't fall. It collapsed on top of us. It happened just after midnight. The storm, which had been prowling around the cabin for 2 days, finally decided to break inside. A crack of thunder shook the floorboards beneath my boots, a violent geological sound that vibrated in my teeth. In the same instant, the power grid gave up the ghost. The single lamp by the armchair died, the hum of the refrigerator cut out, and the cabin was plunged into a blackness so absolute it felt like being buried alive. I was moving before the echo of the thunder faded. Muscle memory took over. My hand found the grip of my weapon, unholstering it in one fluid motion, though there was nothing to shoot but the night itself. I didn't reach for a flashlight. Light draws fire. I moved through the pitch black by memory, counting steps. 3 to the hallway, 5 to the bedroom door. Julian? My voice was a low rasp, pitched to carry without traveling through the walls. I didn't get an answer. I reached the doorway, my pulse hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I wasn't afraid of an intruder. I had secured the perimeter 3 times. I was afraid of what the silence was doing to him. I pushed the door open, stepping into the threshold but not crossing it. That invisible line on the floor was the last boundary I had left. Then the sky tore open. A massive sheet of lightning reduced the world to stark, blinding white. For a split second, the room was frozen in a strobe effect. I saw him. He wasn't sleeping. He was sitting on the edge of the mattress, wrapped in the duvet, his feet bare on the cold wood floor. He was facing the door, facing me. The lightning bleached the color from the room, turning him into a statue of pale skin and dark shadows, his eyes wide, unblinking, fixed on where I stood in the dark. Then the dark rushed back in, heavier than before. "I'm here," I said, holstering the weapon. The click of the composite polymer was loud in the room. "The power is out. It's just the grid. The perimeter is secure." "Secure," he repeated. His voice came from the darkness, disembodied and trembling. It wasn't the tremble of cold. It was the vibration of a wire pulled until it snaps. "You keep using that word. It's the job, Julian. You're safe." "I don't feel safe." The admission hung in the air, fragile and devastating. I reached for my tactical light, intending to flood the room, to show him the locks were engaged, the windows shuttered. But something in his tone stopped my hand. He wasn't talking about the locks. Another flash of lightning lit the room, softer this time, a rolling sheet of illumination that lingered for a second. I saw him clearly. He was hugging his knees, his posture collapsed. He looked stripped, just a man sitting in the dark, starving. "You're standing in the doorway," he whispered, "like a sentry." "I am a sentry," I replied, though the conviction was draining out of me with every beat of my heart. "I know," he said. "You're over there, watching, assessing. You're always over there, Elias. Even when you're 2 feet away, you're miles away." He took a shaky breath. "I can't do the distance anymore. The silence in this room. It's too loud. It's drowning me." I gripped the doorframe. The wood was rough under my fingers. "What do you want me to do, sir?" The honorific slipped out, a desperate attempt to rebuild the wall between us. "Don't," he snapped, the word cracking. "Don't call me that. Not here, not in the dark." He shifted on the bed, the duvet rustling like dry leaves. "I don't want you to guard the door, Elias. The danger isn't out there." He paused, and the silence stretched tight, humming with the static of the storm. "I'm cold. I'm so cold, and it has nothing to do with the heating." I stood frozen on the threshold. My orders were clear. Maintain distance. Remain objective. But my orders didn't account for the way his voice broke on my name. They didn't account for the magnetic pull that was dragging me forward, a gravity stronger than the Earth's. "Elias," he whispered. It was a plea, a surrender. "I need you closer than this." The words hit me like a physical blow. "I need you closer than this." It wasn't a request for security. It was a confession of necessity. He wasn't asking for a bodyguard. He was asking for a witness. He was asking to be held by someone who saw him as something other than a target. I looked at the darkness where I knew he was waiting. I looked at the invisible line of the doorway. Crossing it meant breaking the protocol. It meant shattering the professional distance that kept us both alive. But staying on this side meant leaving him alone in the dark, and I realized, with a terrifying clarity, that I would rather take a bullet than let him shiver for one more second. I let go of the doorframe. My hand dropped to my side, brushing against the useless gun. I took a breath, inhaling the charged air. "Okay," I breathed into the dark. I took the step. I crossed the threshold, leaving the bodyguard in the hallway and bringing the man into the room. The floorboards groaned under my weight. a sound that seemed deafening in the sudden quiet between thunderclaps. It wasn't a tactical approach. I wasn't clearing a room or securing a corner. I was surrendering. I walked to the side of the bed, my boots heavy on the wood, and I sat down on the edge of the mattress. The springs dipped under my weight, shifting the geography of the bed, pulling him slightly toward me. He didn't pull back. He exhaled, a long, shuddering sound that released the tension he'd been holding since we left the city. I didn't get under the covers. That was a line I couldn't cross, a boundary that felt too final. Instead, I swung my legs up, lying back on top of the thick down duvet. I was fully dressed, boots, holster, tactical vest still strapped tight against my ribs. I was a jagged line of hard leather, Kevlar, and steel intruding into his soft, warm world. I lay on my back, staring up at the invisible ceiling, my hands resting on my stomach, right over the weapon. "You're still wearing the gun," Julian whispered. His voice was close, too close. "I'm still on duty," I lied. "No," he shifted. I felt the mattress move, felt the warmth of his body radiating through the layers of goose down and wool. He had turned on his side, facing me. "You're not." I turned my head. Another flash of lightning, distant now, washed the room in a pale, diluted gray. It was enough to see him. He was curled up, his cheek resting on his hand, looking at me. The shadows hid the billionaire. There was no imperiousness in his eyes, no demand. There was just a raw, terrifying openness. We lay there in the dark, the storm raging against the glass, but the noise felt miles away. The only sound that mattered was the rhythm of his breathing. It was ragged at first, uneven, catching on the edges of his panic. But as the minutes stretched into hours, as the silence settled around us like a heavy blanket, I heard it change. His breath deepened, slowed, and then, without either of us trying, it synced with mine. Inhale. Exhale. Inhale. Exhale. It was an intimacy deeper than skin. We were sharing the air, trading the same oxygen in the small, enclosed space. I felt my own heart rate drop, the adrenaline that had been pumping through my veins for 2 days finally receding, leaving behind a strange, heavy calm. I wasn't waiting for an attack. I wasn't analyzing exit routes. I was just existing, here, in the dark, with him. Then, he moved. It was a small movement, tentative and blind. His hand slid out from under his cheek, moving across the expanse of the duvet cover. I watched it in the shadows, a pale shape navigating the dark. He wasn't reaching for me. He was reaching for an anchor. His fingers brushed against my forearm, the sensation searing even through the tactical fabric of my jacket. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. His hand drifted down, tracing the line of my wrist, until his fingers found my hand where it rested on my stomach. He hesitated for a second, a heartbeat of indecision, and then he laced his fingers through mine. The contact was grounding. His palm was warm, his grip firm but desperate. I squeezed back, a silent promise. We didn't speak. There were no words left that wouldn't ruin it. We just lay there, hand in hand, staring into the dark. I realized then that the job was dead. The contract was void. I wasn't guarding a body anymore. I wasn't protecting an asset from a bullet. I was guarding a heart from the crushing weight of its own isolation. And in doing so, I had left my own chest wide open. I fell asleep like that, fully clothed, armed, holding the hand of the man I was supposed to keep at arm's length. When I woke, the storm had broken. The room was filled with a soft, gray morning light that filtered through the shutters. The air was still cold, but the bed was warm. I didn't move. I didn't check the time. I just lay there, feeling the weight of Julian's head resting on my shoulder, his breath warm against my neck. He had moved in the night, seeking the heat, bridging the last of the distance. The vigil was over, but the bond was sealed.